Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil 2 Remake, Hardcore difficulty, Claire 1 scenario, no damage, knife only, S plus walkthrough, and this is going to be from the garage area all the way to the beginning of the sewers area. And for the most part, this is all pretty easy to do. You can easily get past a lot of the enemies, you're not going to have anything too taxing, and I don't even know if I should even commentate on it. I mean, I'll probably just go on different tangents, because this is all so simple. I mean, there are several situations that I'll definitely talk about, like this section here, even though this isn't too bad, because lickers are so easy to get past. And if you're wondering how the lickers work, they can hear you when you're walking, and if you continue to walk, they will slowly creep towards you and change their directions to catch up to you. But if you stand still, then they'll lose you entirely. The moment you decide to sprint, they will start to attack. Like right there, they started to go into a combat status, but they can't actually get to me because they cannot go through doors. And now that we're over here, we can grab the diamond key, and this guy will always get up when we pick up the diamond key. On the second run, he immediately gets up when you open his casket entirely. And then, as long as you get to this door over here, you'll be fine. Before that zombie ever has a chance to grab you. Now, when we're trying to backtrack through this room, we need to get the licker to kind of notice us, and then we need to go back through this door. He's going to readjust himself, he's going to climb onto the wall, and we can just get past the two of them, because they will always do this every time. And you gotta make sure you are still walking and you don't sprint when you exit this room, because there's another licker that spawns when you're backtracking through this room, and he's going to be around the next corner. He's on the ceiling. On my first playthrough of this game, he caught me because I wasn't aware he was there. And it was definitely clever of Capcom to put in there. I gotta give some props to Capcom for cleverly placing that guy there just to catch people out thinking they were safe. So, kudos to you, Capcom. But, right there, did you hear how close he was just then? Lickers on this game are ridiculous. When they are in a combat status, they gain some ridiculous speed boosts. They run at light speed. The movement animation they do does not properly correlate to the speed at which they're moving. It almost looks like they're just gliding. It reminds me so much of the Revenants from Resident Evil Revelations 2, because they did the exact same thing. When you tried running away from them, they got on all fours, and they started to do this movement animation that gave them such a speed boost that it just didn't make any sense realistically whatsoever. It was just such a cheap artificial handicap. And going back to the lickers, they also have some really bad hitboxes on their attacks. They have the ability to hit you without having to touch you because of how crap their hitboxes are. How is that acceptable? I will never understand. And not only that, but lickers have ridiculous amounts of life. Somehow they can take 5 hits from a Magnum to go down. And it just doesn't make any sense for a Magnum to behave like that. When you see a Magnum in a Resident Evil game, you expect it to be so powerful. You expect it to really give you this kind of feedback that you're expecting. But it's not like that on this game. The Magnum is so underpowered on this game, and a lot of the weapons feel very underpowered and useless. And it's all because of the fact that the game is just designed around knife only. Capcom made this clear in a statement. They said this game is designed around knife only. So that's pretty much the best possible way you want to play this game. You want to do it knife only, because doing it with all the weapons isn't really going to change up your experience any differently to what you're going to be doing knife only. Because you're going to be running past all the same enemies, you're going to be just avoiding them all together. It's just literally the exact same experience. And this is quite ironic, because Capcom said in a development video for this game that this game offers some very diverse gameplay, but what exactly is so diverse about the gameplay if it's designed around knife only? And other than the fact that, you know, the weapons on this game are very underpowered, you know, you have all the lack of enemy types, this and that, and this game, people say that this game offers a lot more of an enemy diversity compared to Resident Evil 7, but the only diverse thing I see about the enemies is the different ways they just screw you over with poor designs. For the most part, there's only about 4 enemy types you're dealing with. You're just dealing with zombies, lickers, G-adults, and dogs. I'm not even going to mention the IVs, because the IVs on this game are probably my least favorite enemy type, because they feel no different to a zombie whatsoever. They behave in the exact same way. The only difference being is that they are a lot more keen on getting flinched, because if you shoot their bulbs on their chest and around their body, then they will always flinch. But other than that, they're really no different to a zombie. And I don't know why people are so impressed by the IV design. I found the IV design in Resident Evil 2, the original version, to be a lot better, even though they didn't really do anything. But they had some pretty cool design choices. Like, for instance, in the original version of Resident Evil 2, if they grabbed you, you could actually shake out of the grab and not take any damage, which was so cool. And right here, Speaking of enemy types, we're being introduced to Mr. X, and Mr. X is by far the most bullcrap AI system ever introduced in the Resident Evil series by far. He's absolutely bullcrap. He is so omniscient, he knows exactly where you are, he happens to just appear everywhere, wherever you seem to go, just to screw you over. And he doesn't even kill enemies. A big guy like him doesn't kill any enemies. How is that an interesting enemy design? It's so lazy in design just to make it seem like he's just this threatening enemy. And I talked to Seraphim17 about Mr. X, asking how would you counter a statement from somebody saying, if Mr. X could kill enemies, then the game would be too easy. And Seraphim17 replied, saying that if Mr. X could kill enemies, but every time he killed an enemy, he would actually gain an increase in his damage, to the point that he can probably instantly kill you after 3 enemies he killed. That would be a really interesting design choice. And sadly, Capcom didn't put that kind of design choice, and that's quite ironic, because that's the kind of design choice Capcom would put in for their enemies. But they didn't, because this new team at Capcom, it's like they didn't even know what they were doing. Like, they were so skeptical about discussing certain things in their interviews. Like, for instance, they acted like this was the very first time they were designing an over-the-shoulder game. So they were like, oh, it's going to be very challenging trying to hide these enemies in a way that's actually interesting. That's not the fixed camera angle. But what the heck are they talking about? Resident Evil 4 was the very first over-the-shoulder game ever made, and they're acting like it's new. Oh, and by the way, you saw me engage in combat with that licker. That wasn't intentional. What I was trying to do was I was trying to exit the room after triggering him, because every time you do that, he always leaves the room. It's just for some reason he gets stuck on the wall and he just takes even longer than usual to get out of the room. So that's why I unfortunately ended up going into combat with him. And as you saw, combat with the lickers is pretty simple, so long as you can get behind them. But even then, it's still kind of risky, because there's always the possibility that the licker will jump backwards to try to readjust himself or to do an attack. And if he does that, he will hit you very easily. Or there's also the possibility that he will jump onto the ceiling, but you can easily just stay behind him, and he's forced to eventually drop down if he's not able to get to you when he's on the ceiling. So, for the most part, lickers are pretty easy to deal with. And Carcinogen SDA did say that he was having a lot of trouble finding a good way to deal with the lickers. He said this in his interview with Hideki Kamiya, but I don't really understand how we could possibly struggle with the lickers. If I can somehow find a good method for dealing with the lickers, then he surely can as well, right? I mean, he is this popular YouTuber who's supposed to know everything about Resident Evil, right? Well, not everything about Resident Evil, because he absolutely blanked out on Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, and also 7. And I saw his no damage, no save attempt on Resident Evil 7, and the kind of strategies he was using, it's clear he just didn't devote enough time to understanding Resident Evil 7. Like, he didn't even try to use the crouching or the blocking for particular purposes. And he only ever used the crouch against the Chainsaw Jack fight. But that was really it. And it was all to do the looping technique. And why the heck would you need to do the looping technique against Jack? And if you have to resort to the looping technique for Jack, then you are just a crappy gamer if you need to do that. Because fighting Jack normally is a lot of fun. And speaking of Jack, Jack is far more interesting compared to Mr. X. Jack is not bullcrap compared to Mr. X. He is not omniscient, and he has a lot more moves at his disposal compared to Mr. X. And you can actually dodge them in a way that actually feels believable. Because even though Ethan Winters had no combat experience, he's still clever. Because he actually has a brain. I don't get it. I don't understand how they can go from making a game that was as fantastic as Resident Evil 7, and then go to a game that is inferior in design in so many ways. Heck, I can't even find the passion necessary to call this a Resident Evil game, because this game feels so standardized. It feels no different to every other survival horror game you've played. Because nothing about it just feels unique. The only thing unique is just the characters and the enemy types. Everything else, when it comes to mechanics and enemy philosophy and design philosophy and like survival horrorness, it all feels so standard. Like, nothing about it feels so unique or Resident Evil-esque. I don't even think they took a lot of risks with this game at all. I think they took way more risks with Resident Evil 7, and it just paid off in the end. Like, for instance, with the camera perspective, Resident Evil 7 is a first-person game, but because of the fact that it's first-person, everyone's calling it a crap game, and it's just so funny thinking about it. And I did actually get into a discussion with a bunch of people from a Resident Evil community on the PS4, and they were like, we just can't deal with the first-person perspective. It just feels so awkward on the eyes. I'm more used to seeing a character on the screen. I need to see all the character, not just the arms. And I'm sorry, guys, but that is the most subjective form of thinking ever. That's literally akin to being a picky baby. Do you really want to be a picky baby when it comes to judging a game like that? And do you really want to base your criticism around something like that? If you can't adjust to something as simple as a camera perspective, then you shouldn't even be playing games. But no, you believe that camera perspective has a bigger impact on gameplay than gameplay mechanics? And other things? Like, what the heck is wrong with you? I mean, I would agree with this statement if it was in relation to fixed camera games, because the fixed camera angle in the older Resident Evil games was awful. It was really bad. Not only did it delay your inputs all the time whenever it swapped between each of the individual camera angles, but every time you swapped between the camera angles, the game would just freeze. It just took you out of the experience every single time, and it just gave the enemies these really cheap ways to hide. It's like, why give the character a head or eyes? That's just how I felt about that particular statement when I heard it, and I've heard many people say this statement before, and all I gotta say to that is, what the heck is wrong with you people? These same people will probably look at the zombies on this game and call them scary because of how they look. And I'm sorry guys, but if you're going to judge how you fear an enemy based on how they look, you are just dwelling on ignorance. There's more to an enemy type than just looks. You have to look at how this enemy type behaves in combat. You have to look at the mechanics. You have to look at everything involved in that. And that's why I just can't fear any of the enemies on this game, because they are bullcrap in design. They require all of these artificial handicaps just to make them feign lethality. And just to comment on the zombies' looks, I don't even consider them that terrifying to look at. In fact, I'm honestly surprised they don't appear more mangled and more deformed and more torn than Call of Duty World War II zombies. If you've seen the zombies on that game, they are all that. They are just deformed, they are torn, they are mangled. You can definitely tell they were experimented on, and that's why they look so ferocious on that game. And I can't say the same for the zombies on this game. They don't look very ferocious in the slightest whatsoever. But now we have this little section here, which isn't even worth any commentary in all honesty. It's such a boring section. I mean, it's pretty cool your first playthrough, but then this just becomes a time waster because you're doing absolutely nothing on this section. It's practically no different to an interactive cutscene. That's exactly what I would describe this section. And I'm just going to bring up another piece of criticism with regards to Resident Evil 2 Remake. The side characters on this game, namely Ada and Sherry, their sections are incredibly short. They do absolutely nothing to really diversify the gameplay in a way that's interesting. I mean, Sherry is just avoiding chief irons in an interactive cutscene, and then Ada's having to run past a bunch of zombies, and her section's just incredibly short, and you're doing a bit of mild puzzle solving, and that's it. But that's really it. In Resident Evil 7, when you're playing as Mia, you're doing so much more. Her section lasts for half an hour, and it just feels like a necessary change in diversity, and the ship level itself, it feels like you're doing so much more. You're not doing anything in the orphanage, you're not doing anything in that one small area of the sewers whatsoever. It's very disappointing. Yet another reason why I would just give criticism to Resident Evil 2 Remake. But at least on the Ada section, you're actually doing something. This, you're not doing anything at all. You have to do this section every single time you want to replay Claire's campaign, and all we're doing is just watching Chief Irons do this full path. And then, once he's over there, you've pretty much done the section, because all you gotta do is just hide underneath this table, and just wait for Irons to go to the bathroom, and that's it. That's literally all you do. And I just can't help but wish that there was an option to skip this whole entire section. I mean, look at the Mia videotape from Resident Evil 7. That was a completely optional sequence. It worked off the exact same design as this section right here, where you're just having to wait for Marguerite to complete her full path before actually moving. But it was completely optional. That whole entire sequence was reserved for first-time players, and then you didn't have to deal with it anymore once you decided to replay the game again. Why wasn't it the same case with this game? Why is it that Resident Evil 7 has so many of these cool features, yet all of that was lost in this game, and it made it inferior in design? What could possibly prompt Capcom to make the decisions that they made? I really don't. But we finally got the key and we can get out of here. This whole entire sequence is just a testament that Capcom is not capable of doing such sections in survival horror games, and I'm really glad because I hate these kind of sections in survival horror games. I just think they're very unrealistic, and a lot of times the main character just gets a lucky pass that allows him to escape from these inescapable situations. And once you recognize this aspect, it turns the survival horror into a horror simulator, and that's what you get with games like Soma. And Soma was so boring. And it's definitely understandable why Soma was a boring game to play, because it's made by the same developers as Amnesia, and Amnesia was just as boring to play, because that game has absolutely nothing to its enemies, and nothing to its mechanics whatsoever to make it replayable or interesting. And I bet if Capcom were to make a horror simulator where you can't fight back whatsoever, it would be pretty boring to play, because if that Sherry section just then was as boring as it was, it would be pretty boring as well. But we are back inside of the RPD building, and we are playing as Claire again. And now that we have the garage keycard, we can get out of here. And I go the wrong way just then, and I recognize my error. You're supposed to go back through the elevator. And you're back inside the garage. And now we have to make our way to the orphanage before we proceed down into the sewers. And we're going to be dodging a bunch of dogs once we get outside. And there are a couple of zombies in the way, but they aren't a problem whatsoever. Oh, and I almost forgot about Mr. X. If I'm forgetting about Mr. X in this section, then it's definitely clear that he is not a problem in this section whatsoever. For the most part, you're just going to be laughing as he's just continually following you with that moody stare of his. It's so goofy. How can people consider Mr. X to be scary when he's just walking like he does in such a business-like attitude? And then he has that goofy face of his that makes it look like he needs to take a number 2. And then he can't even kill zombies. A simple zombie that he can't kill. He's such a baby. What a toddler. I hope Nemesis can actually kill zombies in Resident Evil 3 Remake. And speaking of Resident Evil 3 Remake, I have actually pre-ordered Resident Evil 3 Remake. And the first thing I'll say is that the PS4 home theme that I received when I pre-ordered Resident Evil 3 Remake is so much better than the PS4 home theme I received when I pre-ordered Resident Evil 2 Remake. Because it actually plays one of my favorite themes from Resident Evil 3, and that is Nemesis' final transformation. And that theme alone made Nemesis' final boss fight so tense. It really captured the survival horrorness of Resident Evil properly. And it just made that boss fight stand out so much. And the fact that it was playing on the PS4 home menu theme made me so happy when I heard it. It was so much better than the music that plays for Resident Evil 2 Remake's PS4 home menu theme. Because all that music was just the music that plays when you're in the East hallway. And that is not enough to make you feel related to that game. The moment they decided to put in a very familiar theme from Resident Evil 3, I just felt so engaged with Resident Evil 3 Remake already, and I already feel hyped for it. If the theme sounds as epic as it does, then I hope the game is going to feel as epic, because I loved Resident Evil 3 a lot. Resident Evil 3 was a really fun game, even though it did have a lot of problems with dodging and with other mechanics and with other enemy types. But it was definitely the first step for Resident Evil when it came to developing an identity. Because that game made it really clear that Resident Evil was going to be embracing lethal but fair enemy designs. And if they can do the same thing in Resident Evil 3 Remake, it could potentially jumpstart the series back on track to the Resident Evil series that I know and love. But I doubt it, because if Resident Evil 2 Remake is going to become the standard convention for all future Resident Evil games, then it might not be the case. So even though I'm hyped for Resident Evil 3 Remake, I'm still going to proceed with a lot of caution. And when I say a lot of caution, I mean a lot of caution. And that's exactly what I did in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and look how that turned out. And hopefully that's not going to be the same case with Resident Evil 3 Remake. But right there, we were encountering the dogs. The dogs are pretty tricky to dodge because they're kind of random and they're kind of sporadic in their behavior. And normally, the dogs have a bit of a cooldown after they attack where they don't do anything. But there are times when the cooldown doesn't apply. So you get these moments where the dogs immediately initiate an attack after they do an attack. It happens every so often, but it's not too rare though, so you gotta be very careful. The dogs, for the most part, are a pretty fair enemy. They flinch very consistently from shots and whenever they're knifed. Although there are some moments where whenever they're in a turning animation, they don't flinch. But as long as you kill them very quickly, you shouldn't have a problem. I'm just glad that they aren't like Resident Evil 1 Remake dogs, because the dogs in Resident Evil 1 Remake are probably the worst dog enemy in the mainline Resident Evil titles, because they take almost 0 hits done, and they oftentimes cheat, because you can't actually hit them out of the air, and they had some pretty bad hitboxes, and they had almost ridiculous range on their attacks. They are definitely the best example of how not to make a dog-like enemy in a Resident Evil game. But right here we're being chased by Mr. X, which is honestly very pointless, because there's no way he can possibly catch us. And once we get over here, we are in the sewer area, and I know I said previously that I would stop the video at the beginning of the sewer area, but I don't really consider this to be the beginning of the sewer area because there's barely any enemies to deal with. The only enemies we have to deal with are just going to be 3 zombies, and they are very easy to run past. The next video is going to be where the sewer section really begins, and the sewer section is filled with a lot of bullcrap, and you're having to backtrack a lot of the areas. And you're going to be dealing with a new enemy type, which is the G-Adult. And the G-Adults are pretty bullcrap. And I'm going to talk about them a lot in the next video. But this is the end of this part of the Claire's campaign, so stay tuned for the future parts. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.
Hold on, Sherry. I'll be right there.